Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into what I think is one of the most fascinating, complex, and honestly paradoxical relationships in all of human history. We're looking at human evolution, our underlying biology, and our deeply intertwined history with smoke and the tobacco plant. For literally millennia, humans and smoke have been completely inseparable. This is a story of raw survival, of incredible botanical addiction, and of a multi-billion-dollar global empire that completely, fundamentally reshaped the modern world.
Okay, let's dive into this roadmap. We've got Born in the Smoke, earliest traces of tobacco, innovations in inhalation, a global tobacco empire, and finally, we'll wrap up with the modern reckoning. Section 1. Born in the Smoke: How Human Biology Adapted to Fire.
Think about it. Long before modern civilization, early humans harnessed fire for warmth, protection, and cooking. But doing that meant living in really confined spaces just filled with smoke. Over hundreds of thousands of years, our bodies, and specifically our lungs, were literally forced to adapt to this incredibly harsh environment just to keep us alive. Which brings us to a super fascinating biological paradox. If our lungs practically evolved to handle the heavy smoke from ancient campfires, why exactly does smoking today kill us?
Well, the answer is really a tale of two entirely different environments. On the left here, notice our ancient resilience. Our lungs developed some absolutely incredible defense mechanisms against basic wood smoke. We're talking things like mucociliary clearance to basically sweep away particles, a really robust immune system to fight off irritants, and this amazing ability to regenerate tissue. Our lungs are incredibly tough. But look over on the right at our modern vulnerability. Today we face chronic, unrelenting exposure to heavily concentrated smoke that is just packed with volatile compounds. When you bombard those ancient campfire-ready defenses with modern cigarettes day after day, year after year, those resilient mechanisms eventually just get completely overwhelmed. And that results in conditions like COPD, asthma, and lung cancer.
And we actually have the anthropological proof that smoke has been wearing down human lungs way, way before commercial tobacco even existed. Just look at these examples. You've got Utsi the Iceman, a famous mummy from 3300 BC who died in his 20s but already had soot-blackened lungs and the early signs of COPD. Or take Henutmehut, an ancient Egyptian mummy who suffered from emphysema purely from indoor fire exposure. By the 16th century, miners were developing severe lung diseases from breathing in coal dust. Our lungs have literally been taking a beating for thousands of years.
In fact, humans have been intentionally utilizing smoke for an incredibly long time. 12,000 years. That is how long ago ancient hunter-gatherers across Southeast Asia were using low-heat, slow-burning fires specifically to smoke dry and mummify their dead. They mastered the chemical properties of smoke to preserve remains, which proves that human beings have understood and manipulated smoke for over 100 centuries. It's wild to think about.
Section 2. Earliest traces of tobacco: Pushing back the timeline of human use. Now we shift from general campfire smoke to the intentional consumption of the tobacco plant itself, 12,300 years ago. Just let that number sink in for a second. For the longest time, we thought tobacco use was a relatively recent development in the grand span of human history. But a really groundbreaking archaeological discovery in the arid deserts of modern-day Utah just completely rewrote the timeline. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it paints a picture of ancient life. At what archaeologists call the Wishbone site, they uncovered exactly 4 charred tobacco seeds inside a 12,300-year-old hearth. This area used to be a sprawling marshland, which explains the duck bones they found right alongside those seeds. Because the nearest natural habitat for this specific tobacco species was miles away, it proves these highly mobile ancient nomads were intentionally carrying tobacco with them over massive distances. They were likely chewing or sucking on clumps of the plant, known as quids, to get that nicotine hit, and then simply spitting the tiny seeds directly into their fire.
And human experimentation with psychoactive plants certainly didn't stop there. Jump forward to over 4,500 years ago in the Pacific Northwest, and indigenous peoples were utilizing a whole variety of native plants for smoking. Take kinnikinnick, for example. It's this narcotic mixture utilizing the bearberry plant. It was heavily used in ceremonial contexts, sometimes smoked entirely on its own, and other times mixed right in with wild coyote or Indian tobacco. It was like an ancient botanical mashup.
So, by the time Europeans actually crossed the Atlantic, tobacco was already deeply entrenched in the Americas, and its effect on the newcomers was immediate and profound. As the 16th century historian Bartolomé de las Casas noted about the very first Spaniards in Cuba, quote, They suck, absorb, or receive that smoke inside with the breath, which they become benumbed. They replied they were unable to cease using it. That is just an incredible historical description of nicotine addiction taking hold right from those very first encounters.
Section 3. Innovations in Inhalation. From clay pipes to golden artifacts.
As the desire to consume tobacco and other herbs grew, humans didn't just chew the leaves. We completely innovated the technology we use to inhale the smoke. Which brings us to one of the most famous smoking devices in history, the bong. The word itself actually derives from the 14th century Thai word buang. A buang was essentially a bamboo smoking tube. Adding water to the chamber was a massive technological leap. The water cooled and filtered that really harsh smoke, making the entire inhalation process so much smoother.
The concept of water filtration is remarkably ancient and, honestly, incredibly global. Back in 1100 AD, we see the oldest known underground water pipes being used in Ethiopian caves. If we jump over to ancient Russia around 400 BC, Scythian nomads were literally casting solid gold bongs for ceremonial rituals. By 1400 AD, these water pipes were moving right along the Silk Road straight into Ming Dynasty China. And centuries later, in the 1960s, Western counterculture travelers exploring Asia brought the concept back to North America, completely cementing it into modern culture.
Section 4. A global tobacco empire. How brown gold reshaped the world. Following the Columbian Exchange, tobacco shifted from a regional indigenous plant to an absolute macroeconomic juggernaut. It became known as brown gold. To really understand its value, you have to look at the painstaking process required to produce it. In early colonial America, cultivating tobacco was brutal, incredibly labor-intensive work. First, wilted leaves were hung on sticks in these massive barns. Once cured, workers would strike the tobacco, laying it out on the floor to sweat. Then came the delicate sorting phase, waiting for the leaves to be perfectly in case, which basically meant glossy and moist enough not to crumble in your hands. Finally, workers packed up to 1,000 pounds of it into giant wooden barrels called hogsheads for shipping off to Europe. 1,000 pounds?
This intense global demand for production had a profound and really sobering reality on the world. Economically, tobacco was so valuable in the Chesapeake colonies that it was literally used as currency to pay for taxes and even marriage fees. Ecologically, the plant was incredibly harsh on the earth, rapidly depleting soil nutrients, which forced constant, aggressive territorial expansion. But most darkly, the sheer amount of grueling labor required to maximize these massive profits drove a horrific shift in the American South, moving entirely away from indentured servitude and directly fueling the brutal expansion of the Atlantic slave trade.
Not everyone was thrilled with this new global habit, though. King James I of England actually penned a famous pushback against tobacco in 1604, calling it a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs, and in the black stinking fume thereof. It is such a visceral, angry description. But you know what the cruel irony of history is? The demand for tobacco was so overwhelmingly lucrative that King James eventually just threw his hands up, gave up fighting it, and instead created a royal monopoly so the crown could profit from all the taxation.
Section 5. The Modern Reckoning. Science catches up with the smoke.
For centuries, tobacco was mostly consumed in pipes, snuffs, and cigars. But as the Industrial Revolution took hold, the way humans consume tobacco is about to fundamentally and fatally change. The turning point arrived right here in 1881 with the invention of the bond sack machine. Before this, rolling cigarettes was a slow, manual, tedious process. This machine changed absolutely everything. It chopped and rolled tobacco 13 times faster than a human worker ever could. Basically overnight, it revolutionized production, making the modern perfectly rolled cigarette incredibly cheap, perfectly uniform, and highly accessible to the masses. It basically launched the cigarette century. And this brilliantly illustrates how, as mass production boomed, science slowly but surely began to catch up with the smoke. By the 1930s, doctors were completely baffled by a sudden, sharp spike in lung cancer, a disease that, historically, used to be incredibly rare. In 1950, British physiologist Richard Dahl published groundbreaking data directly linking smoking to this massive cancer spike. By 1954, a huge 20-year study of British doctors undeniably confirmed the severe mortality risks. Finally, in 1964, the U.S. Surgeon General issued the landmark report officially condemning the hazards of smoking. The era of big tobacco operating without any scientific scrutiny was finally over. But let's bring this all the way back to where we started. Why is it that some people can smoke their entire lives and live to old age, while others pass away much, much earlier? Researchers point to a really fascinating phenomenon called the survival bias paradox. Remember those ancient fire-adapted lungs we talked about at the beginning? They are remarkably tough. Because our biology is so incredibly resilient, it allows many people to smoke for decades before the physical damage becomes critical. Most COPD patients aren't even diagnosed until they are 65 or older. Ironically, the very fact that a smoker lives long enough to develop a chronic disease like COPD actually proves just how remarkably resilient their ancient lung biology was in the first place. They survived the smoke for decades before their body's defenses finally broke down.
So what does this all mean? The crucial point we are left with in this explainer is a lingering, pretty profound question. For over 1 million years, our lungs adapted to survive the smoke of the very campfires that kept our ancestors alive. But today, we've extracted the absolute most addictive chemical of the tobacco plant and heavily mass-produced it. Could our widespread addiction to nicotine actually just be an evolutionary glitch? Did the very biological resilience that saved our ancient ancestors ultimately get hijacked by our modern habits? It is absolutely something to think about the next time you look back at the incredibly long, smoky history of humanity. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.